"If I could turn back time, if I could find a way," sang Cher a few years ago, whilst strutting around an American battleship, wearing little more than a strategically placed ribbon, a see-through body stocking, and a couple of tattoos on her ass. She wasn't alone, of course. As she seductively straddled the barrel of a gun turret like some kind of huge metallic dildo, she was ogled and cheered by 100 or more salivating and worshipping sailors, who seemed to be indicating that this strange creature strutting around before them with a vacuous grin on her face was just the thing that they had signed up to protect from harm. This was what they had pronounced themselves willing to die for, the zenith of their culture. Is it any wonder then that in the aftermath of the tragedy in New York, we heard so much bemusement from the Americans regarding the apparent fact that some people appear not to like them very much, that some groups and cultures view them with suspicion and dread, even disdain and hatred? But it ought not be surprising to us that some cultures view the wholly unconscious worshipping of the feminine that is exemplified by most every part of American culture as a kind of social disease, and one that they should be inoculated against, if not one that they should seek to forcefully eradicate. Nor should the intensity of this negative reaction surprise us in the face of the fact that this insipid decadence has the desire to impose itself on other cultures by any number of means, both overt and covert. Why shouldn't the so-called East view the so-called West with tremendous suspicion, even trepidation and loathing? Look at our cultures. Our greatest social heroes, or those that we most readily acknowledge and take an active interest in, are mindless actors, violent rap artists, female singers whose only real talent is that of flaunting their bodies and sexuality, supermodels whose one and only talent is walking up and down wearing someone else's clothing. In short, we worship brainless sluts, that is to say, people who behave in a sluttish fashion towards society, and think ourselves more civilized than those that don't. I mean, are we serious? The difference between Western culture and that, say, of the Middle East, when it comes to women and the feminine, is not so much in the significance we grant them, because it's clear by the way women are treated in the East that the feminine is granted a great deal of significance, but rather in the level of awareness and consciousness with which we treat them. Both forms of civilization basically worship the feminine, but there appears to be a greater appreciation for the nature of the feminine in the East, which is why certain aspects of its cultures seek to control and even suppress it. Now, of course, I'm not advocating such suppression, I'm simply pointing it out at this stage. When these cultures see the overt and unadulterated spewing out of the feminine and female sexuality into the world by the West, they view it as a releasing of wild, uncontrollable and dangerous animals into the world. And when you see spectacles like Cher prancing around in next to nothing with hundreds of trained military men worshipping at her feet, like Muslims praying to Mecca, you can kind of see their point. It's a bit like having a pimp drop by your dinner party with a bunch of scantily clad whores who spend all their time rubbing up against your guests and propositioning them. One can well understand why the host would want to make them leave. Of course, just for good measure, the whores will probably then proceed to press their naked breasts against the windows from outside the house, forcing the partygoers to draw the curtains. And when they do, they'll have to suffer the ignominy of being called backward, or uncivilized, or inhibited, or living in the 7th century, by the fools who understand not one whit of their own behaviour. How many of us would truly feel comfortable if the next-door neighbours regularly held full-on orgies in their backyard, and kept dropping in and inviting us over, or kept wanting to borrow some milk, or sugar, or petroleum jelly, or began spilling over the fence in sexual rapture and greeting our protests with comments like, "Get with it, man, this is the 21st century." What if they were more wealthy and therefore powerful than we are, and could basically ignore our rights and desires? What if they actively sought to recruit your wife or 16-year-old daughter to their lifestyle? It's the unrestrained decadence that the East fears as much as anything else, and however much we might observe that this fear is somewhat generational, it still exists. There is a fear of a breakdown of social values and cohesion. One does not have to be some puritanical right-wing Christian type to sympathize with such fears. One only has to look at American homelessness and crime rates to get an insight into what happens to a nation that allows itself to slide into such unconsciousness. And, moreover, These perceptions don't have to be entirely valid for them to nevertheless exist, and for us to be able to comprehend them. You don't have to agree with someone to be able to see their point of view. You merely have to want to see it. Of course, all of this speaks only to certain elements of popular American culture, and is far from the whole story. But that's the dimension of a culture that is most often vigorously presented and proselytized. So, the next time you watch an episode of Jerry Springer or Ricky Lake, ask yourself whether other cultures have good cause to fear the influence of American, and more generally, Western culture. Ask yourself what it is about such behaviour that might make it a worthwhile cultural export commodity.